Imagine for a moment that you are in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by water in every direction as far as the eye can see. The scorching sun beats down on your face, your lips are cracked, and the only thing you can think about is the thirst consuming every fiber of your being. Now imagine that you've been in this situation for 3 weeks, with months still ahead before reaching your destination. How is it possible for someone to survive this? This is not fiction. This was the brutal reality faced by thousands of sailors, explorers, and passengers who ventured across the seas during the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries and beyond. Men like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan, all of them faced this deadly challenge that today seems almost impossible to overcome. But here's what's truly fascinating. They not only survived, they conquered entire oceans. The natural question is, how on earth did they do it? The answer isn't simple. It involves an extraordinary combination of primitive science, superstition, luck, and methods we would now consider both ingenious and desperate. But before diving into these survival techniques, we need to understand the sheer scale of the problem these men faced. When Vasco da Gama left Lisbon in 1497 to find a sea route to the Indies, he knew his journey would last at least 6 months. 6 months at sea, without stopping on land to resupply fresh water. Can you imagine carrying enough water to last that long? For a crew of 170 men. And here lies the first mystery. The math simply doesn't add up. A man needs about 3 liters of water per day to survive under normal conditions. At sea, under the blazing sun and doing heavy physical labor, that need could double or triple. Multiply that by 170 men over 180 days, and you end up with an astronomical amount of water, somewhere around 100,000 liters. And that's not even counting the water needed for cooking and other essential uses. But here's the problem. The ships of the time simply didn't have the capacity to carry that much water. Columbus's caravels, for example, were only about 20 meters long. So how was it possible? The first part of the answer lies in something sailors discovered out of sheer necessity. Water didn't need to be perfectly pure to sustain life. This seemingly simple discovery revolutionized sea travel and enabled the age of exploration. Sailors learned they could drink a diluted mixture of seawater and fresh water in a proportion the human body could tolerate without becoming completely dehydrated. But this was far from a perfect solution. In fact, it was dangerous. Drinking salt water regularly would eventually lead to madness, hallucinations, and death. Historical records are full of terrifying accounts of sailors who, in desperation, drank seawater and began to see mirages, talked to non-existent people, and eventually died in agony. So how did they actually survive? The answer lies in a combination of techniques that were part science, part art, and part divine luck. And one of the most fascinating was rainwater collection. Navigators developed elaborate systems to catch every drop of rain that fell on their ships. They used sails as giant funnels, channeling the water into specially prepared barrels. But here's a detail few people know. They would first let the rain wash the sails for a few minutes before collecting the water to remove the accumulated salt. It was a technique that meant the difference between life and death. But what about when it didn't rain for weeks? Or when they were sailing through regions where rain was rare or non-existent? This is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. The navigators developed a technique we'd now call primitive distillation, but at the time it was seen as almost magical. They discovered that they could boil seawater in covered pots, and the vapor that condensed on the lid was fresh water. Imagine the brilliance of that. Men with no formal scientific education, in the middle of the ocean, discovering the basics, principles of distillation centuries before it became common knowledge. They literally turned salt water into fresh water using only fire and metal pots. But this process was extremely slow and dangerous. Making fire on the deck of a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean was a huge risk. A single mistake could set the entire ship ablaze, which meant certain death for everyone aboard. Plus, fuel was limited, usually firewood that had to last the entire journey for cooking, so sailors had to be extremely selective about when to use this method. It was reserved for the most desperate situations, when death from dehydration was imminent. But there's an even more fascinating technique, one that reveals the incredible adaptability of the human spirit, the use of human urine. Yes, you read that right. Sailors discovered that urine, when distilled using the same method as seawater, could produce drinkable liquid. It was disgusting, desperate, but it worked. And it wasn't just a last resort tactic. Some experienced navigators included it in their survival plans from the start of the journey. They developed systems to collect and store urine and then distill it when necessary. So imagine the mindset required for that, men willing to do literally anything to survive and complete their missions. But perhaps the most ingenious and least known technique was what they called wind water. Navigators observed that under certain atmospheric conditions, especially in the early morning hours, dew would accumulate on exposed surfaces of the ship. They learned to place cloths and sponges to absorb the dew, then wring out the collected water. It was a process that yielded only small amounts, but in desperate situations, those drops could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine men waking up before dawn, crawling across the ship's deck to collect dew with cloths. This was survival at its rawest. But here's something that may surprise you. Not all the fresh water sailors carried was actually fresh to begin with. They discovered that they could dramatically extend the shelf life of potable water by mixing it with other liquids. Wine, for instance, wasn't just an alcoholic beverage on board. It was a method of water preservation. The alcohol acted as a natural preservative, preventing the growth of harmful bacteria. Navigators would mix wine with water in specific proportions, creating a drink that lasted much longer without spoiling. And here's something even more intriguing. They also used vinegar. Yes, vinegar mixed with water not only killed bacteria, but also provided some essential nutrients that helped prevent scurvy, the disease that killed more sailors than storms and pirates combined. This discovery of using vinegar is particularly fascinating because it shows how sailors, through trial and error, arrived at solutions that had real scientific basis, even without understanding the science behind them. Now, you may be wondering, how did they know when these mixtures were safe? How did they distinguish between a solution that would keep them alive and one that would kill them? The answer lies in an extraordinary oral tradition that developed among sailors. Knowledge passed down from generation to generation, from captain to first mate, from seasoned sailor to novice. It was a living library of survival techniques, tested under extreme conditions and refined over decades. And how did they distinguish between what was safe and what was deadly? Through signs they learned to recognize with their lives at stake. For example, they discovered that distilled seawater should never taste salty. If it did, it meant the process had failed and the water still contained enough salt to kill. They tested this by placing a single drop on the tongue. If they tasted even a trace of salt, they discarded the entire batch. For mixtures of fresh water with wine or vinegar, they developed specific ratios based on observation of symptoms. If someone began hallucinating or vomiting after drinking a mix, it meant the concentration was wrong. The problem was that these signs only appeared after it was too late for those who drank first. The most experienced sailors learned to recognize subtle signs. A healthy man's urine should have a specific color. If it was too dark, it indicated dangerous dehydration. But if it was completely clear after drinking a mix, it could mean the kidneys weren't processing the liquids properly. But this knowledge wasn't always accurate, and mistakes cost lives. There is a terrifying record of a Spanish expedition in 1524, where 40 sailors died in 3 days after drinking a mixture of seawater with fermented fruit juice. The captain had followed a recipe passed on by a Venetian navigator, but he didn't know that this technique only worked with specific fruits and under certain temperature conditions. Another tragic case occurred in 1518, when a Portuguese crew tried to distill water using a technique that supposedly had worked on another voyage. The problem was they didn't know the original technique had been used with water from a specific region of the Atlantic, where the salt concentration was different. The result was water with high levels of other harmful minerals that caused mass poisoning. One of the most disturbing aspects of this history is how social hierarchy manifested even in the distribution of water. On many ships, officers and paying passengers had priority access to fresh water, while common sailors had to make do with smaller rations and lower quality water. This created desperate situations where men literally died of thirst while watching. Others drink clean water just a few feet away. It was a cruelty that's hard to comprehend today, but was accepted as a natural part of the social order at the time. But perhaps the most impressive thing is how some navigators not only survived, but thrived under these extreme conditions. Men like Ferdinand Magellan, who led the first circumnavigation of the globe, developed such efficient water management systems that his crew arrived at their destination in better health than when they departed. How was that possible? The answer lies in a combination of meticulous planning, exceptional leadership, and an intuitive understanding of nutrition and hydration that was centuries ahead of its time. Magellan, for example, insisted that his crew eat citrus fruits whenever possible during land stops, even without knowing exactly why. Today we know this prevented scurvy, but at the time it was considered just one of the captain's eccentricities. That intuition saved countless lives. He also developed a water rationing system that took into account not just the available quantity, but also each crew member's physical condition, the work they performed, and even their psychological state. It was a level of managerial sophistication that would be impressive even by modern standards. But even the most experienced and prepared navigators faced situations where all conventional techniques failed. And it is in those moments of absolute desperation that some of the most extraordinary stories of human survival emerged. There is the account of a Spanish caravel that ran aground in a storm in 1503, losing all its supplies of fresh water. The crew survived for 3 weeks by drinking the blood of fish they managed to catch. The blood, though salty, contains less salt than seawater and provides other essential nutrients. It was a desperate, repugnant technique, but it kept 23 men alive until they were rescued. Imagine the mental state required to make that decision, choosing between certain death from dehydration or the chance of survival by drinking fish blood. Another, even more disturbing account comes from a Portuguese expedition in 1511, where the crew discovered they could extract liquid from the eyes of large fish. It was a tiny amount, but in extreme situations, those drops made a difference. The technique spread among navigators, becoming part of the survival arsenal in desperate conditions. But perhaps the most revolutionary discovery was made by accident during one of Columbus's voyages. After a particularly violent storm, the crew noticed that the water stored in oak barrels had a different taste and seemed to last longer without spoiling. Later investigations revealed that oak wood acts as a natural filter, removing impurities and inhibiting bacterial growth. This discovery completely transformed water storage on ships, and oak barrels became standard equipment on all maritime expeditions. But here's something few people know. Not all types of wood worked. Cedar, pine, and other woods commonly used in shipbuilding actually contaminated the water, making it unfit for consumption. It took decades of experimentation and many deaths to identify which woods were safe for storing drinking water. This constant experimentation, this willingness to try anything to survive, created a culture of innovation among navigators that was centuries ahead of its time. They were essentially empirical scientists, testing hypotheses in floating laboratories in the middle of the ocean, and the discoveries didn't stop there. Navigators learned that certain types of marine plants, when chewed, released liquids that helped quench thirst. Specific seaweeds contained fresh water within their cellular structures. It was primitive botany, but it worked. They also discovered that some fish held more usable liquid than others. Rays, for instance, had a very high concentration of fluid in their muscles, while sharks had blood that, though not ideal, could sustain human life for short periods. But perhaps the most ingenious technique, one that demonstrates the incredible adaptability of humans, was what sailors called floating gardens. On very long voyages, some captains began cultivating plants that stored water in their stems and leaves. They discovered that certain succulents and cacti could survive the salty sea atmosphere, and that their leaves contained fresh water. It was agriculture on a microscopic scale, yet it provided a few precious drops of clean water regularly. Imagine the patience required to grow plants on a rocking wooden ship, protecting them from storms and saltwater, all for a few drops of water, every few days. It was dedication to the point of obsession, but it saved lives. As techniques developed and spread among sailors, something resembling a primitive science of maritime survival began to emerge. Experienced captains kept detailed journals, recording which techniques worked in which conditions and how long each type of rationing could safely last. These journals became invaluable treasures, passed down through generations as survival manuals. They contained information on everything, from how to spot rain from a distance to how to calculate exactly how much fluid a man needed to survive in different temperatures. Yet even with all this accumulated knowledge, death from dehydration on sea voyages remained extremely high. It's estimated that up to 30% of sailors died of thirst or water-related diseases. It was a brutal price humanity paid for expanding its geographical frontiers. And here's something that might surprise you. Many of these survival techniques continued to be used well into the 19th century, until naval technology finally caught up with the challenges of water preservation. For over 400 years, men continued relying on these primitive but effective methods to survive the oceans. The final question that naturally arises is, why would they risk their lives this way? What motivated men to face such seemingly impossible challenges? The answer lies in a mix of factors: greed, scientific curiosity, religious fervor, and something more primal, the irresistible human drive to discover what lies beyond the horizon. It was a time when maps ended with the phrase, "Here be dragons," and men were willing to risk everything to find out if it was true. These sailors weren't just explorers, they were pioneers of survival techniques that saved thousands of lives and made the expansion of human civilization across the seas possible. Their discoveries about how to live without potable water represent some of humanity's earliest steps toward mastering the oceans. And perhaps the most impressive part is that many of those techniques are still relevant today. People lost at sea, castaways, and survivors of maritime disasters still use variations of the methods developed by those courageous sailors centuries ago. The next time you turn on a tap and clean water flows freely, remember those men who risked everything to expand the boundaries of the known world, armed only with ingenuity, courage, and a fierce determination to survive against all odds. They turned the impossible into possible, one drop at a time.